Hey guys, so is Flutter about to win over the web? As you guys know, I've been an advocate of Flutter since its inception. I looked at it, I said, this looks like a cool technology, something to keep an eye on. Not necessarily run out and learn absolutely, but it looked pretty good. It's been a year or two, I guess, since it came out. And yeah, so let's take a look at this article. Flutter is about to win over the webs. So this was written in February. The cross-platform framework offers the most compelling web development experience. Websites today, including the one you're using right now, are written in HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. You probably read that and think to yourself, well, yeah, that's patently obvious. There we go. If I told you to create a website without using any of these technologies, you would probably have some questions. And yet, throughout the course of history, we've had many players in this space. We've had Flash, Silverlight, which is basically Microsoft's version of Flash, all competing technologies that have attempted to shave off a slice of the browser market, to let the developer use different technology to create a website. But none of them have really taken off. Well, hold on. Let me just go back to large Stef here. Well, Flash took off. Flash was pretty bloody big. It was huge. It was, it didn't replace websites. But let me tell you, there were a lot of websites that made heavy use of Flash. So I don't know about that comment there, but let's get back into it. So how is it possible that I am coming to you, dear reader, and telling you that there could yet again be a competitor in this space, especially after literally none of the other players in this space have gone anywhere despite years of efforts? Well, as I said, Flash went pretty far, but it never replaced the stuff. Well, let's take a minute to appreciate the things that these past attempts have in common, namely, they needed a browser plugin to run. They normally need a platform-specific browser plugin to run on a targeted platform. Silverlight is a good example of this, so is Flash. At the time, people who used Linux couldn't watch Netflix as the site depended on Silverlight, which wasn't available for Linux. Sure, there were open source alternatives, but nothing first party. They introduced security vulnerabilities. Flash was notorious for this. Over 1,000 known vulnerabilities. I know Flash's vulnerabilities got one of my websites, killer sites, repetitively hacked in the past, unfortunately. Thank God Flash is dead. The browser could have to load the plugin, display the content, and at that point, none of the security safeguards of the browser matter, as the plugin had complete access to the host computer. Yeah, so these plugins are basically just separate pieces of software that literally plugged into web browsers. Anyhow, the performance was not as good as pure HTML. This is true. I won't get into that. HTML5 came, and CSS improved. Suddenly, creating beautiful, involving experience wasn't impossible with the web. Better still, browsers that hated standards, used weird hacks or vendor-specific implementations instead of their CSS equivalents, like Internet Explorer, were killed off. Okay, so what happened? I'll give you a little background on this, so just in case you're young nerdlings. In around early 2000s, there was this movement called the Web Standards Movement. And the Web Standards Movement was a big push to force browser manufacturers to adhere to the official specification. Before I go on, you know, if you've been following this channel, but I've been talking about more and more about health and nutrition and getting in shape and how important that is. And as such, I've been working with my buddy here. You can see him pre and post on a program specifically designed for developers. So this is for people who may not have time to go to the gym. And the fact of the matter is, most people in the whole diet, nutrition, and exercise world, any personal trainer will tell you that weight loss is much more about controlling what you consume, how you consume your food, and much less about exercise. So this program is actually a personal one-on-one coaching program. It doesn't require you to do hardly any exercise, and you're going to learn about how your body processes food. So if you're familiar with keto, fasting, good habits, superfoods, etc., this is what this program is all about. I invite you to take a look. Go to thebodydeveloper.com. You can sign up free consultation, 1-week trial. You're under no obligation. If it's not for you, no worries. But I think a lot of people will find use with this. We have been demoing people for a little while now, and people have gotten really good results. People losing 10 and 15 pounds or more within the first couple of weeks of coaching with Oren here. So take a look at thebodydeveloper.com if you want to get in shape. We're sitting all day as developers, not good for your health. And the most important thing you can do is learn to control your consumption and the type of food and to have good habits and the support system to help you follow through. This is a 5-week program. It's very cool. I've developed this with him and working with several people, and it works really well. So yes, the web standards movement was the push by basically a bunch of grassroots activists to push the browser manufacturers to follow the official specification, because back in those days when we were building websites, we had to build one for IE, a version for IE, and then we had to figure out how to make the code work in other browsers. It was a big mess. Going back to the 90s, a big part of this was because the browsers, everybody was trying to take market share, and the thinking at the time by the browser manufacturers, namely Netscape, Microsoft, which is Mozilla, not Microsoft, excuse me. Netscape became Mozilla, Firefox, and then by Microsoft with IE. IE was once the most dominant. The thinking at that time was that we will dominate the web by having a browser that does things better, has better tricks. The problem is if IE implemented a particular feature set or a way that they would handle set tags or indeed their own set of tags, the other browser didn't necessarily do that, so there'd been a conflict, and it got even more insidious than that, whereas the one browser would implement its default behavior slightly different from another browser in terms of the way things are positioned on the page, as an example. So it's just a bloody nightmare. So the web standards movement back in those days, they were pushing hard. It was an advocate group, and then they were coming up with all these hacks and ways of basically being able to write CSS code to structure your websites and still have them work across different browsers. Anyway, that's all gone now. Fantastic. Everything's good. One thing he hasn't pointed out in this article, so far anyway, one of the main reasons Flash got killed, HTML5 came, CSS3 came, very powerful, but also because of Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs, and he admitted this in his book, he had a personal gripe against Adobe because Adobe didn't help out Apple when Steve Jobs first came back to Apple. So he wanted to kill Flash. Adobe owned Flash. So he said, that's it, Flash not running on any iOS device, Steve Jobs said. And he said it was because it was slow and it was buggy and it was a security problem. This is all true. But the main reason, according to, I think it was in the book that was published after Steve Jobs died, was he wanted to get back at Adobe, if I recall. Anyway, Steve Jobs had a huge hand in killing off Flash, which was the last alternative to browser-based fancy app development, if you will. And then HTML5 rose, partly because of Jobs, I would say. And there you go, Bob's your uncle. Then the whole thinking changed. They realized the browser manufacturers, IE, Explorer, Microsoft, and Chrome rose, and they embraced the standards. Whoever would adopt the standards would do better in the marketplace. So it was just a change of thinking in the marketplace. Anyway, let me go back to this article, sorry. All these things made the choice to create a web app in native HTML easy, HTML5. After all, if the technology that you use to create a web experience got deprecated and stopped receiving security fix, then there was no option but to rewrite your app from scratch in a new supported language. But how did we get here in the first place? How did HTML become such a mainstay in today's thriving internet? Well, I think I told you that. On the 6th of August, 1991, the web went live to the world. Then, eventually, we had the so-called dot-com bubble come and go. Now, I was there during those days, buddies. Consider for a moment that the web only came into existence, into the public use in 91, and then 9 years later, the dot-com bubble burst, costing an astonishing $1.7 trillion. That means that the that the dot-com bubble cost about as much as 15% of the United States GDP that year. Okay. We're in that part of history. We're in that part of history because that's about the time when the web was starting to become more and more formal. The way we were writing websites was becoming more standardized. Over time, we gained standards like HTML4 that we could use, and these standards ensured that HTML you write in your part of the world will work for most, if not all, HTML interpreters. Cascading style sheets, CSS, also entered into circulation in '96, and the year before that, JavaScript also entered the scene. Can you imagine seeing or using a website with no JavaScript or CSS? It would not be an enjoyable experience, that's for sure. All right, let me skip ahead here. Okay. When the web first came into existence, people were not using apps as they are today. Some of you remember using terminals that acted as thin clients, giving you a physical connection to the mainframe, on the other end, a physical connection. Okay, well, let me just scroll past this. It comes to, as no surprise then that the basis of HTML pages is to produce an HTML document. If you ever used any, I'm reading this for the first time with you guys, by the way. It comes to no surprise that the basis of HTML pages to produce an HTML document. If you ever used any JavaScript, you will be familiar with functions like document.getElementById. This is basically JavaScript code that allows you to grab a hold of tags in your web page. An element is a nerd's fancy word for tag. Anyway, HTML tag. Everything you do on a web page is to produce and then transform a document. Yeah. Traditionally, most web pages are too high to fit in one viewport, so the user would have to swipe through the pages with a finger or scroll with the mouse. I can't think of a website that I use today that fits neatly into the user's viewport. That's the screen. The viewport is the screen that you see. So the developer would always be guaranteed there would be some part of the page would either be above or below where the user is currently looking at the page. Okay, let's see where this guy's going here. But still, you would want certain parts of your web page to stay in a certain position or align in a certain way. You start using things like position in CSS to control where your elements are laid out. There's a ton of CSS properties, 520 to be exact. As the name would imply, these styles cascade into their child elements. Okay, blah, 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 blah. If you're using an existing framework, Angular material, then it also gets pretty zesty. Okay, so he's going on about basics. Yeah, so yeah, use CSS, and there are CSS frameworks, which are just bunches of code, neatly packaged up that you can use to speed up the process. The most popular by far is Bootstrap for CSS. Learning the language. In order to create a simple website, you need to be across 3 separate languages. You need to be across 3 separate languages, all right. And that's purely a website style. That's HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Your website has to look and feel great. It can't do that if you don't know how to write performant JavaScript if your CSS styling is bad. No, a website can look very good without JavaScript, by the way. You can just do it HTML, CSS. If you actually want your website to do anything, then you might use a framework like Angular or React or Vue. Vue is another one. As you start to bring in packages via NPM, the size of your apps will start to grow. Okay, NPM is Node Package Manager. It goes way beyond web design. That's if you're getting to web apps that's using Node and JavaScript. So, okay, let's go on. Once you have your website and you have your package, you need to use a bundler to bundle up your client app to make sure that it works in their browser. Depending on what browser they're using, you also need to shim in certain features so the users can actually use your website. A shim is kind of like a hack in a way where you add some extra, again, I'm not going to get into the details. You're basically adding some extra elements or little libraries you can provide that will basically account for any browsers are not able to support some of the code that you're writing. Support means it doesn't read or process the code that you're writing properly. That's becoming much less of an issue these days, if it's much of an issue at all, depending on who your target audience is. Anyway, if your If you're using language like TypeScript, Webpack also transpiles from this language into JavaScript. Nothing about this is inherently bad, but it is very complex and has a lot of moving parts. You'd guess that by reading this article. If your website breaks, did you mess up the code? Did the minification break it? I wouldn't do minifications unless I really had to. Did Webpack not include it properly, or did the transpilation process introduce a problem? These complicated pipelines can introduce difficulties in debugging or finding the root cause and issue of your app. Oh boy, that's a big introduction. How are we doing here? How is Flutter any better? If you heard of Flutter, you've likely heard of it in the context of phone app development. So how on earth does this apply to websites? Well, with a normal HTML page, you deal with the page as a document. In Flutter, though, the page, or what the user interacts with, is actually drawn to an HTML canvas. Flutter actually controls every pixel that is drawn to the screen and doesn't use HTML, JavaScript, or CSS to define any of its look or logic. Technically speaking, native Dart code is transpiled into JavaScript through Dart.js, but no business logic is actually written in JavaScript. This is a very high-level article, guys. So if you're totally new to development, web development, there's some things you're probably not getting here. Dart is a programming language, and you write your Dart code, and then it gets processed and it transformed into JavaScript. So, because Dart will not run in a web browser. You've likely picked up two alarming things that sentence. First, no HTML. Second, we're drawing everything on canvas. I get it. It sounds weird. And in the case of drawing to the canvas directly, not very performant. Let's dig in a little bit more. Canvas is something introduced in HTML5. It allows you to literally draw pixels to the screen. You can do this with JavaScript, of course. Drawing into canvas instead of the document. How are we doing for space here? What's going on here? Okay, we're almost done. Starting to get bored, guys. In the first point, we're not using HTML to write our web pages, nor are we writing things to a document. At first blush, this is complete heresy, but what exactly are you doing when you develop a web page in HTML? Well, as we covered earlier in the article, you make a document that's too big for the viewport of the user's device, and then they scroll. What you're reading right now on this very page, the document height is greater than that of the viewport, and you're scrolling through the content, because he never gets to the point, this guy. I'm just kidding. When you think about it, isn't this kind of weird way to design a user interface, to expect that the content will be too big vertically and that the user will have to scroll through it? What if you want the user to scroll left or right, or instead of top to bottom? Well, that's this bad usability. You don't ever want people to scroll left to right. They've done tests over and over and over again. Left to right navigation, 2 thumbs down. Don't do it. It is not particularly easy to express on a normal web page. You can do it. In Flutter, at one point, left to right navigation was experimented with, like scrolling left and right, rather. In Flutter, if you want to make a particular bit of context horizontal scrollable instead of vertical scrollable, that's easy as wrapping the widgets in a single child scroll view. All right. You can also specify the direction of scroll easily, whether to scroll vertical or horizontal. Okay, because Flutter is based on the concept of laying out your page in individual widgets, not drawing a document to the screen, developers are afforded more control over exactly how they want to lay out their applications. That's good. That's good. Sticking to one language. As previously mentioned, creating a website means that you have to know HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. It also means that your knowledge doesn't transfer between these languages. You can't reuse any of your JavaScript knowledge in HTML, for instance. I'm not even going to get into that. HTML is purely your markup language. CSS is purely your styling language, so syntax. JavaScript is purely your programming language. None of these options include things like type checking, so your CSS can be complete bunk and will just fail silently when the user tries to use your page. Okay, this is, anyway, you test, Flutter uses Dart as its language, and all of the application look and feel and business logic written in it. Dart comes from static type checking, and no safety is landing soon. So every line of code in your app, whether it be used to describe your app visually, give your app style, or control the business logic of your app, is fully type safe. Easy to lay out your app. Broadly speaking, if you use websites to display data from another source, whether a source is a database, an API, or something else, we wind up with data that we would like to display. Imagine that we have an array of objects returned from our API, and you're using something like Angular to display them. Typically, you would load these objects into the backing component, and then use *ng4 to iterate through them. You'd likely attach that to a div. Out of the box, though, for an unstyled div, a div tag, it would look pretty plain. You probably want these items in the list to appear in a column or row, so you'd have to involve some CSS or Flexbox in making this happen. Conversely, with Flutter, you lay out your children by using column or row, and that has a child property, has a children property rather, that accepts array objects. Then, when you think about it, most of the time, you probably want your arrays of objects in a row, side by side. Okay, so it's basically control over every pixel in the viewport. Goodbye Webpack. Because Flutter uses Dart, when Flutter app is compiled for its target platform, it transpiles all the dependent packages, also written in Dart, to JavaScript as well. Dart is a type-safe language that doesn't support reflection. This leads to better tree shaking and minification of your app. Building your Flutter app for the web doesn't use Webpack because it doesn't need it, which is a pretty strong case for Flutter in itself, in my mind. There's nothing wrong with Webpack. It's a high-quality piece of software, but it's a complicated tool in an already complicated pipeline. So we're not quite there yet. Hold on, I'm going to scroll because I'm quite there. Drawing everything to the canvas also has performance implications, but these aren't as bad as you think. I made a test app that makes heavy use of visual effects. It runs nearly 60 frames per second on my MacBook. Even when you drag the sheet over the screen, it still performs okay, progressively increasing the blur of the image behind. I'm not an expert in Dart by any means, so no doubt this process could be optimized further. So there are a couple of key areas that Flutter needs to improve on before people will consider it for mainstream web development. But think for a moment, Flutter only really came out in the last 2 years, and the performance and feature set that it already has is nothing short of incredible. What could it be then? What could it be then if we could make a website that was performant and you could use one language to design, style, and write the business logic for your web app? If Webpack became superfluous to your development pipeline, and if you could have server-side rendering and all the SEO goodness that you have today in traditional HTML-based website. If you had all that, then Flutter could win the web. All right, so there's that article. Yeah, you know, he's got his angle there. What's my comment on that? HTML5, CSS3, and JavaScript will not be replaced entirely by Flutter. I think Flutter, or any Flutter-like technology, will be a supportive technology for the foreseeable future. And I like Flutter. It's got a nice logo. It's got a good name. I'm joking. Well, it does have a nice logo. But it's a good technology. But it's not a panacea. It's not going to replace HTML. And he's creating a few straw men here, meaning he's creating scenarios that making it seem that HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are so difficult. It's not really once you to get your head wrapped around it. That to say, I think Flutter's a good tech, so it's something worth looking into. So there you go. All right, if you're interested in learning more from me, I have a pro developer mentoring program. You can find it at studioweb.com/mentoring. Links below. And it's my most advanced program. It has everything that I teach. It's lifetime access. You can pay monthly, depending on the level, or you can pay one shot, get a discount. It's kind of like my virtual boot camp, and we have bi-weekly Zoom meetings, access to all my course content, access to my certifications, access to private content that only the mentors get involved with. This is about a year old, this program. And I've limited talking about it because I always want to be sure that I can handle the group, because there's an option you can get direct consultations with me. So people really love it. People really love the program, and people are getting jobs and landing gigs and so forth. So if you like that mentoring environment. Check out, again, studioweb.com/mentoring. Check that out and you'll find out all about the program. And you can decide if you want to get involved. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me directly and Stefan at Studioweb, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. But we cover everything. We cover code training, and we have the sport community. We have communication psychology training, private consultation with me. We want to make it flexible so you're not set to any particular schedule. As I teach, whether it takes you a month to learn JavaScript or 2 months, doesn't matter. You work at your pace. Everybody's got different schedules, different aptitudes. So this mentoring program really represents modern educational practices. All right, thanks for watching the video. Bye-bye.